Hello and welcome to episode 2 of season 2. Mr. Piano, good to see you again. And joined today by one of our favourite people to speak to on an almost daily basis at the moment, Zach Rosenberg. Good to see you.
Likewise, great to be on here.
So as you know, this season is sort of focusing on our partners within the sort of H3 network, a network designed to be out there to try and give people the confidence of working with people from all over the world that have a real sort of understanding of this space, a great client base, frankly, many anecdotes of things going very well and things going very badly. We couldn't think of a better person to have on to discuss at least one of those. Wanted to sort of begin with your background more than anything else. You can go on to sort of LinkedIn and you can look. You did 8 years at PwC, M&A, tax advisor, all very sensible. I'm sure your parents were very proud of you. And then suddenly, come 2022, you launch this thing. Talk us through it. What made you make that decision? We now have Rosehill Legal. How's it gone? Why did you do it? Where do you want to take it?
They're going great. I wouldn't change anything about it. So yeah, I was at PwC for 8 years, like you said. I was fairly close, I think, to going into the partner pipeline, and I just wasn't all that interested in making partner there. It was a wonderful firm. It was a wonderful experience. Frankly, the people that I worked with and worked for were some of the smartest people I've ever encountered. And you can't really beat the client base in terms of complexity and the type of work you're doing. So I wouldn't change that portion of my career. I learned a ton, and those guys really shaped who I am today and as a professional.
Is it just law that you do now, or is it the whole gamut of things? I mean, what are people looking for in you? Because this is an area where we can stay in our lane and say, right, this is the Cayman position, or all right, 99% of things that you're asking about aren't really Cayman law specific. So here's our invoice and go ask someone else. Mm-hmm. What we try to avoid that, and with our time in the market and our perspective on things, we really kind of go into the weeds. We give perspective on things, although we can't necessarily give concrete advice because it's not within our range of engagement, but we try to be as helpful as we can. But you're involved in loads of different projects, kind of as outside counsel, kind of more like sort of the go-to guy. So how do you think that reputation has been built? Because your name in the market, on the various Telegram lawyer groups and so on, is very well regarded. But what is it regarded for? What's your kind of value add here in your USP that other people don't have?
I think to an extent, it is number one, having been in just the industry since 2017, non-professionally, just engaging with community, learning the stuff, being, degenning in the stuff. Phil, hat tip to you. Just being, actually being involved in the community before going out and doing it professionally. So I have that sense of how the market looks overall, not just from a legal perspective, but also from a product perspective, being a user of the products, seeing how community reacts to certain things. So I have found myself being more of a holistic advisor of also, depends on what they need and what they ask for, but go to market, different product trends, like, for example, trends now, like, the point system for farming airdrops and things like that, as different, call them popular mechanisms. People call them like the metas of the current day roll out. I speak with a lot of clients about what those are, how I see them playing out, and obviously the legal consequences associated with them. But I think also I do largely have my training to thank for that, because I as somebody who did a lot of cross-border M&A at PwC, I have a lot of experience coordinating across a whole bunch of different functional teams in a whole bunch of countries. I had one deal where I was coordinating 18 jurisdictions. It's miserable. But, that sort of experience gives me has sort of given me the ability to, see, sort of rise to the 30,000 foot level and see how everything fits together and thinking through all of that stuff. And that really helps me think about the big picture rather than staying in specific lanes of, well, from a regulatory perspective in the US, this would be X. Whereas, you can think about, okay, so how do you think about this from an EU perspective, from a Cayman perspective, BVI perspective, different areas and different jurisdictions, I think that's been a huge help and helped me really learn more than anything.
I'm often having conversations, as are you probably, with clients where the idea of them setting something up, putting a bunch of assets in there, and then it's not their assets anymore, it's not their personal war chest, that can sit uncomfortably sometimes. They're giving up control, they're
Yeah,
giving up the purse strings. But if you want to do this properly, you've got to respect the separation.
yeah. The offshore structure needs to have its own function. It needs to have its own business. It just does. And I tell clients that all the time. And I tell them if they're not willing to give up that control, if they want to manage every little piece of everything, that it's probably going to end up being a waste of money to set one of these structures up, much to, some of the offshore counsel's chagrin, but not yours. I think you're aligned in that you want these structures to work. You don't want to set up a bunch of structures that don't work, because
Yep.
that's not a great look for you. That's one of the reasons I like you guys a lot, is because you're on board with that. Not every firm is. So that is something that is appreciated from you guys. But yeah, it is a very difficult conversation to have. And if you look across the industry, really, there's a lot of regulatory pressure to make things worse for token holders and for the community. There just is. You look at the current environment in the U.S., securities laws. There's active and serious incentives to driving value away from the token, which is a very
Yep.
perverse outcome. Because of the global regulatory environment, there's also active incentives for the team to shift functions and value away from themselves when they are the ones who are building it. Unfortunately, that's created an environment where if you are offering a product that involves transactions in those types of assets that are in that gray area, you're driven, depending on, again, where your risk curve is, to maybe move a lot of these functions away from yourself and move them offshore. And I really don't like that conversation with them, because it's their project. You don't want to have to be telling your clients that, to make this work, you have to give it up.
And do you
It's
think
unfortunate.
do you think this very thing is the nature of why you've built, an incredibly impressive client base? You have this great sort of stellar reputation because you're willing to go into these conversations. You're willing to look at the envelope. You're willing to look at a grey area that frankly exists globally at the moment. I think it's impossible to point at any jurisdiction in the world and say there's certainty in this space. Is that your true USP, that you're willing to not only look at it but also talk about it pretty candidly, as you have today, pretty candidly with all of your clients?
It's possible. I don't know. It's hard for me to say. I don't really think about what I do that makes me successful, to be honest. I just do stuff. So I do think that clients appreciate honesty. I think that clients appreciate that I'm not trying to sell them something.
Yeah.
Not to say that a lot of law firms that are peddling a lot of structures are necessarily driven to be selling, but there is inherent pressure at certain size law firms to do as much business as possible. That said, there are plenty of very sharp and extremely level-headed lawyers at large firms.
I mean, just to ask an important question, and you can keep the answer short, even though it's probably a 3-hour conversation. I mean, looking in from outside, I guess, at the US regulatory space, it's an incredibly odd circus at the moment. And when you combine approaches being taken not only by the sort of SEC, which seems to hit the headlines more than most, but also the CFTC, also the IRS, also the courts, also the political system, the sort of amalgamation of a bunch of incredibly different views, for want of a much different word, it has sort of created this environment that actually is incredibly challenging. And we see an awful lot of projects where, real patriots, people have been in the US their entire lives, are very genuinely considering not only leaving the US, but also renouncing citizenship, for some of them, because
Mhm.
they simply cannot function in this space where they are. What's your take on that? Because fundamentally, this is the biggest environment for this. If this industry, if this technology is going to be successful, it has to be, the US is going to be such a big part of that. But how do you see it right now?
Definitely seeing this a lot. I think at some point unless there's a global decision effectively to try to crack down on the industry, ban the industry, all that stuff. And you're kind of seeing it in um, in some of the, I guess, global industry groups that are frankly mostly run by the U.S. regulators. Um, but absent something like that, I think at some point the U.S.'s hand might potentially be forced. Unfortunately, I think a lot of this is political. There's a lot of there's a there are a lot of members of Congress who, apologies if you can hear my dog. There's a lot of members of Congress who are staunchly against the industry for one reason or another. They've made it part of their platform, and it makes it very difficult to change the environment. Obviously, pretty much everybody believes that the environment may change a little bit when Gary Gensler is no longer SEC chair. We'll see. It kind of depends who wins in the elections next year. But the short story is I don't know. It's very difficult to see where things are going. I think, and I was talking about this with a client yesterday. 2025 is going to be like peak regulatory FUD from a tax perspective, because that's when, if the broker regulations go into force, that's when, if they get finalized, that's when they would start being applicable for the most part. The digital asset reporting requirements under 6050I that have been kind of in the news recently. We got confirmation yesterday that they do not expect anybody to have an obligation right now, they being the IRS, until regulations are prescribed. I expect, and most people expect, that when they do issue draft proposed regulations, they're going to be horrible, and will likely come into force next year, depending on when they're finalized as well. So, we haven't really even started seeing the tax FUD in the U.S., and that's including these offshore structures. I'm not aware of any structure being challenged, any U.S. founding team being held responsible under CFC rules or otherwise for activities of an offshore foundation. So the tax side of things is largely untapped, and that's a little bit scary to me, frankly. Some of the regulations come through in finalized form that aren't as onerous as they were for the broker reporting rules, or will be for 6050I digital asset reporting, and naturally, deemed entities for DAOs and all this other type of horrible stuff that will almost certainly will come to pass at some point. So maybe I'm a natural pessimist, but it's hard to see the environment in the U.S. getting much better in the near future, which is very difficult to say and very difficult to think, but I think it's right.
With this matrix of laws and regulations and tax considerations, a lot of people pay attention to, well, we don't want to get in trouble with the securities regulator, or we don't want to be doing anything which causes any securities issues or potential other regulatory minefields. But it sounds like the tax element is critically important, especially even for offshore structures. Who the director is, that could have consequences. Who is the shareholder of a company, CFC considerations. So it sounds like this may be the year in which people really need to give equal weight to the tax considerations of what they're doing, as well as the regulatory advice and protection.
Yeah, I mean, they should have been doing that previously, and there are several prominent tax attorneys in the space who have been giving, I think, fairly reasonable and good advice. So there are, a lot of founders, a lot of projects who have been considering this properly, but there's also probably a lot more that have not. You don't want the industry cracked down on for certain structures that impact other similar structures that should hold up and that do have substance, just by virtue of being loosely associated with the ones that don't, more or less. So yeah, I think people need to make sure they're paying attention to all of these issues.
Thank you, Zach. I absolutely knew this was going to be a really candid and fascinating canter through this world. I wish we had many more hours to sort of continue. But with that set in mind, it sort of reminds me of the opening of the A team, in the sense that if you're out there, you have a problem, if no one else can help, and hopefully you can find him, and we're obviously hopeful that H3 helps you with that. Maybe you can hire the Rosenberg. It's been great to speak to you.